I want to address, directly and without dismissing it, the objection that will occur to a great many people listening. Surely income matters more than this framing suggests. Surely there's a floor below which no mechanism can compensate for genuinely insufficient earnings. That objection deserves a real answer rather than a slogan, because pretending income is irrelevant would be dishonest. This video has no interest in dishonest comfort. Here is the honest answer. Below a certain floor, survival itself consumes the entirety of available income, and no mechanism, however well designed, can extract a surplus from a number that doesn't cover basic needs in the first place. If that describes your current situation, the immediate priority is closing that specific gap, and that work matters and deserves its own full attention. But for the far larger number of people who are earning a genuinely modest but livable income, and who still find themselves with nothing accumulated year after year, the missing piece is almost never that the income itself is too small to work with. It's that no deliberate mechanism has ever been built to direct whatever surplus does exist, however narrow, towards something that compounds, rather than something that simply disappears into ordinary living. This video is built for that second, far more common situation, and everything from this point forward assumes it. The income ceiling myth. Here is a belief so common it rarely gets questioned directly. I will start building wealth once I earn more. This sounds reasonable. It is also, statistically, one of the most reliable ways to guarantee that wealth building never actually begins, regardless of how much income eventually arrives. The reason is not mysterious once you see it clearly, and Hill documented this exact pattern among people who received sudden financial windfalls, inheritances, lottery winnings, unexpected business success, without a prior mechanism in place to direct the new money. Spending expands to consume whatever income is available, almost automatically, in a phenomenon that has since been studied extensively and consistently confirmed. A person earning a modest income and a person earning 3 times that amount frequently report an identical subjective feeling of barely getting by, because the spending simply recalibrated upward to match the new number, leaving the gap between income and outflow just as thin as it was before, sometimes thinner. This means the actual lever for building wealth was never the size of the number arriving. It was always the size of the gap between that number and everything leaving. A person earning a low income with a real structural gap of even a modest amount each month is, mechanically, in a stronger position to build wealth than a person earning significantly more with no gap at all, because wealth is not built from income. It is built from the surplus that survives income, however small that surplus currently is. This is not a claim that income doesn't matter, or that effort to increase it should stop. We'll address raising income directly later in this script. It is a claim that waiting for a larger income before starting the actual mechanism of wealth building is based on everything Hill documented and everything confirmed since, a strategy that reliably produces indefinite delay rather than eventual wealth, because the ceiling myth doesn't resolve itself when income rises. It simply relocates to whatever the new number happens to be. The corrective starts now, at your current income, however modest, because the mechanism has to be proven at this level before it can be trusted to survive at a higher one. There's a specific reason proving the mechanism at a lower income first actually matters, beyond simply starting sooner rather than later. A habit built and sustained under real constraint tends to survive the arrival of more money, because the underlying discipline was never dependent on scarcity forcing it. It was a genuine, deliberate choice, tested under exactly the conditions most likely to break it. A habit that has never been tested under constraint, adopted only once income becomes comfortable, carries no such proof, and is far more vulnerable to being quietly abandoned the first time life gets busy or a temptation arrives that feels reasonable to indulge just this once. This is, in a sense, good news disguised as an inconvenient truth. The discipline required to build wealth on a modest income right now, while it may feel like the harder path compared to waiting for a raise, is actually constructing something more durable than the same discipline attempted later, because it's being built and tested under the exact conditions that would otherwise be used as the excuse for never starting at all. Today I am going to hand you that mechanism, piece by piece, in specific and practical terms, built entirely around the assumption that you are not starting with capital, connections, or a large salary. Most wealth education assumes you already have surplus money sitting somewhere. This video assumes the opposite, because that is the actual starting position of most people watching, and it deserves a plan built for that starting position, rather than one borrowed from someone who never had to solve this specific problem. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what to buy first, how much of your income should move, and where, and why the years that feel the slowest are, without exception, the years doing the most work. Before anything else in this script will make sense, you need one number, calculated honestly, right now, not your income, not your savings account balance in isolation, your net worth, the single figure that actually tracks whether wealth is being built, regardless of what any individual paycheck looks like. Here is the calculation, and it takes about 10 minutes if you have your account information available. List everything you own that has a real, sellable value, the balance in every bank account, the current value of any retirement account, the resale value of a vehicle you own outright, or the equity in one you're still paying off, any investments, any valuable possessions you could realistically convert to cash. Add these together. This is your total assets. Now list everything you owe, every credit card balance, every loan balance, any remaining amount on a vehicle, student debt, any other outstanding obligation. Add these together. This is your total liabilities. Subtract liabilities from assets, whatever remains, and for a great many people starting this process, that number is at or near zero, sometimes negative, is your actual net worth. Write it down, dated today. This number matters more than any other figure in your financial life, and here is precisely why. Income tells you what flowed through your hands over a period of time. Net worth tells you what actually stuck. A person can earn substantially for years and show a net worth of essentially nothing, because every dollar that flowed through also flowed back out. A person earning modestly, with a small but consistently growing net worth, is factually building wealth in a way the first person, despite the far larger income, is not. This is also the number you will recalculate monthly going forward, the same date each month, in the same place, a notebook, a simple spreadsheet, whatever you'll actually maintain. This monthly recalculation is the only reliable instrument for detecting whether the mechanisms described in the rest of this script are actually working, because week-to-week experience is too noisy and too emotionally colored to serve as an accurate gauge. The number doesn't lie, doesn't have moods, and doesn't get discouraged on a hard week the way a feeling does. It simply reports, with total honesty, whether the gap between income and outflow produced a real, measurable result since the last time you checked. There's a specific psychological function this monthly number performs that's worth naming directly, because it explains why this single habit outperforms almost every other form of financial tracking in terms of actually sustaining motivation across years rather than months. Most financial tracking measures activity, how much was spent in a given category, how closely a budget was followed on any given week. Activity tracking is useful, but it produces a fluctuating, often discouraging picture, because some weeks genuinely go worse than others regardless of underlying progress. Net worth tracking measures outcome, not activity, and outcome, tracked monthly rather than weekly, smooths out the noise of individual good or bad weeks into a trend line that, for anyone following the mechanisms in this script consistently, moves in one direction over any sufficiently long window, even when individual months look flat or slightly negative. This distinction between activity and outcome tracking is, in practice, the difference between a person who quits during a discouraging month because the weekly picture looked bad, and a person who continues through that same discouraging month because the monthly trend line, viewed honestly across the preceding year, still shows clear upward movement despite the rough patch. Build the habit of checking the trend line, not the individual month in isolation, and a great deal of the emotional volatility around this process quietly disappears. Assets vs income. Now we need a precise definition, because this is the single distinction most responsible for separating people who build wealth on modest incomes from people who never do, regardless of how many years pass or how much total money moves through their hands across those years. An asset, in the strict sense that actually matters for wealth building, is something that either produces income on its own or reliably increases in value over time without requiring continuous new spending to maintain that value. A real asset works while you sleep, in one form or another, appreciating, generating a dividend, generating rent, generating interest. Almost everything marketed to you as valuable does not meet this definition, and the confusion between the two categories is precisely what keeps modest incomes from converting into wealth, even when real financial discipline is present. A vehicle, the moment it's driven off a lot, begins losing value continuously and requires ongoing spending, insurance, fuel, maintenance, just to remain functional. This is not a criticism of owning a vehicle, which is often a genuine necessity for earning income in the first place. It is a precise statement that a vehicle is not an asset in the wealth-building sense, however large a purchase it represents, and treating it as one is a category error that quietly derails many people's sense of their own progress. The same applies to nearly every consumer good marketed with the implication that it represents accumulated success: electronics, clothing, most furniture, nearly anything that depreciates the moment it's used. None of these are wrong to own. All of them are, financially speaking, the opposite of an asset. They are ongoing liabilities disguised, often quite deliberately by marketing, as signs of wealth already achieved. Real assets, for someone starting with a modest income, tend to fall into a short list, and I want to name them specifically rather than leave this abstract. Shares in publicly traded companies, purchased through a low-cost brokerage or retirement account. A retirement account itself, if it holds real investments rather than sitting idle in cash. A property that either appreciates or produces rental income, in some cases ownership in a small business or a stake in one, and in a more foundational sense, a body of specialized knowledge or a skill that reliably produces income independent of any single employer, which we'll address directly in a later section, because it functions as a genuine asset, even though it doesn't appear on a net worth statement in the conventional sense. From this point forward in this script, every dollar of surplus is being directed toward one category only: things that meet this strict definition of an asset, not things that look like success. Things that function, mechanically, as ongoing engines of value, whether or not anyone else ever sees them. I want to name one more distinction that trips up this exercise for a great many people, because it involves a category that genuinely sits in a gray area rather than falling cleanly on either side. Education, in the general sense, does not automatically qualify as an asset simply by virtue of being education. A credential pursued without a clear connection to increased earning capacity functions closer to a liability, given the cost and time invested against an uncertain return. But specific, targeted education, chosen because it directly and demonstrably increases what you can earn or produces a skill that can be applied immediately toward income, functions as a genuine asset in every sense that matters here, because it produces ongoing value, increased earning capacity, without requiring continuous new spending to maintain it, in exactly the same structural way a dividend-paying investment does. The test, in both cases, is the same test applied to every other category on this list. Does the thing in question produce value on an ongoing basis without requiring continuous new spending simply to sustain that value, or does it require constant reinvestment just to keep functioning at its current level? Apply this test rigorously to every purchase and every decision going forward, and the asset versus liability distinction stops being an abstract financial concept and becomes a practical filter you can run in seconds on nearly any decision involving money. The savings rate law. Here is a piece of arithmetic that contradicts almost everything popular financial culture implies, and I want you to sit with the actual numbers rather than the intuition, because the intuition is wrong in a way that has cost a great many people years of unnecessary delay. What determines how quickly a person reaches financial independence is not primarily their income level, it is their savings rate, the percentage of income that becomes surplus, directed toward real assets, rather than the raw dollar amount of that surplus. This distinction matters enormously because percentage and dollar amount tell completely different stories depending on the income they're attached to. Consider two people. One earns a substantial income but saves a small percentage of it because expenses have expanded to match the larger paycheck, consistent with the ceiling myth described earlier. The other earns a modest income but maintains meaningful discipline, saving a genuine percentage of every dollar that arrives. Run the actual math on how many years of expenses each person has accumulated in savings relative to their own spending level, and the person with the smaller income but the higher savings rate is very often ahead, sometimes dramatically ahead, of the person earning more but saving less. This works because of a simple relationship. Your savings rate determines two things simultaneously: how much you're accumulating each month and how large a stockpile you actually need relative to your own spending level. Since a person who spends less needs a smaller stockpile to cover the same number of years of expenses, a high earner with high spending needs an enormous stockpile to become independent of their income because their expenses are large. A modest earner with modest spending and a genuine savings rate needs a considerably smaller stockpile to reach the identical outcome because the target itself scales down with the spending. This is not a suggestion to live in extreme deprivation that produces its own failures, which we'll address later. It is a mathematical fact that should change how you evaluate your own starting position. A modest income with real discipline is not a weak starting position for wealth building. In the specific mathematics of reaching independence, it is frequently a stronger one than a large income with no discipline attached to it, because the entire equation runs on percentage, not on the raw number printed on a pay stub. Calculate your own current savings rate right now, surplus divided by total income, expressed as a percentage. Whatever that number is today, the entire remainder of this script is aimed at raising it, deliberately, in stages, starting with the very next section. There's a follow-up question this arithmetic tends to raise, and it deserves a direct answer rather than being left hanging. If savings rate matters more than raw income, does that mean increasing income is a waste of effort compared to simply cutting expenses further? The honest answer is no, and the reason matters for how you should actually structure your effort going forward. Expenses have a flaw. There is a minimum amount required to sustain a functioning, reasonably healthy life, and once spending has been reduced to genuinely necessary and modestly comfortable levels, further cuts produce diminishing returns and, past a certain point, actively undermine the sustainability of the entire plan by making daily life feel punishing rather than simply disciplined. Income, by contrast, has no comparable ceiling in the same immediate sense. Specialized knowledge, additional skills, career advancement, and additional income streams can, over time, raise the numerator of the savings rate equation considerably further than expenses can be lowered on the denominator side, particularly once expenses are already reasonably lean. The correct sequence, then, is not either or but both, applied in the order that produces the fastest genuine improvement to the actual percentage. Bring spending down to a lean but sustainable level first, since this can typically be done faster than raising income, and produces an immediate improvement to the savings rate, and simultaneously begin the slower, longer-term work of raising income through the specialized knowledge development described in an upcoming section, since this produces a larger and more durable improvement to the percentage over the following years, well past the point where further expense reduction alone could reach. Both levers matter. Neither replaces the other. The mistake to avoid is treating either lever as sufficient on its own or waiting for one to be fully maximized before beginning the other, when both can and should run in parallel from the very beginning of this process. Starting small and compounding. I want to walk through actual numbers here, because abstract talk of compounding has become such a familiar phrase that most people nod along without ever seeing the mechanism work on paper, and seeing it work on paper is what actually produces the patience required to let it run. Suppose a modest, genuinely achievable amount is invested consistently each month into a diversified investment, nothing exotic, nothing requiring special access, simply a broad, low-cost investment held over time. In the first year, the growth on that money is barely noticeable, often smaller than the amount contributed directly through your own monthly deposits. This is precisely the period where most people conclude the process isn't working and abandon it, because the visible growth genuinely is small relative to the effort of maintaining the habit. But compounding does not operate on a straight line. It operates on a curve that stays nearly flat for a long stretch and then begins rising with increasing steepness, because each year's growth is calculated not just on your original contributions, but on all the accumulated growth from every prior year as well. The money earns a return, and then the following year, it earns a return on the original amount plus the return already earned. And this stacking effect is invisible in the early years specifically because there isn't yet enough accumulated growth for the stacking to produce a large visible number. This is the single most important thing to understand before starting. The first several years of consistent investing on a modest income will feel almost entirely unrewarding in terms of visible progress. This is not a sign of failure. It is the expected, mathematically necessary shape of the curve, and every single person who has ever built wealth through consistent investing passed through this identical flat stretch before the curve began visibly rising. There is no version of this process that skips the flat years. There is only the choice of whether to continue contributing through them or to stop, right before the curve does the work it was always going to do. The practical instruction here is specific. Automate a fixed amount, however modest, into a genuine investment account the same day income arrives, before it has the chance to be absorbed by spending. Consistency across the flat years matters more than the size of any individual contribution, because the flat years are not wasted time. They are the years accumulating the base that the later, steeper years will multiply. Skipping the flat years to start once there's more money doesn't skip flat years at all. It simply delays them and delays the steep years that were always going to follow the flat ones. I want to make the specific mechanics of this stacking effect fully concrete, because a described curve is easy to nod along to without actually internalizing why it matters this much. Picture the growth generated in year 1, a modest amount since the base being grown is still small. In year 2, growth is calculated not only on the new contributions made that year, but also on the original base plus everything it already grew by in year 1, meaning year 2's growth, even at an identical rate of return, produces a larger absolute number than year 1's did. This same stacking repeats every subsequent year, and because each year's growth is calculated against an ever larger base, the absolute dollar amount contributed by growth alone, separate entirely from your own ongoing contributions, eventually begins to rival and then exceed the contributions themselves. This is the exact point where the curve visibly steepens, and it is also, not coincidentally, the point most people never reach, because it typically arrives only after a decade or more of uninterrupted contribution, well past the point where the early flat years have already convinced a great many people the process wasn't working and caused them to stop. The entire strategic value of understanding this mechanism in advance is that it inoculates you against the single most common reason people abandon investing on a modest income, not lack of money, but lack of patience, through a stretch of time that was always going to look unrewarding by mathematical necessity before it looked rewarding. The first asset. On a modest income, you cannot buy every category of assets simultaneously, so order matters, and getting the order wrong is one of the more common ways people stall out despite genuine effort. Here is the sequence, in the order it should generally happen, and the reasoning behind each stage. Stage 1. A small emergency reserve, before any investing begins in earnest. This sounds like it contradicts everything just said about compounding and the importance of starting early, so let me be precise about why it comes first anyway. Without any reserve at all, a single unexpected expense, a repair, a medical cost, a gap in income, forces the sale of whatever has already been invested, often at exactly the wrong moment, destroying the compounding that had begun to accumulate. A modest reserve, even a genuinely small one to start, exists specifically to prevent that forced liquidation, so that the investing described in the previous section can actually run uninterrupted, rather than being started and stopped repeatedly by every emergency that arrives. Stage 2. Any employer-matched retirement contribution, if one is available, up to the full amount of the match. This is worth naming specifically because it is, mechanically, the single highest guaranteed return available to most people at any income level. Money added to your account simply for contributing your own money, with no market risk attached to the matching portion itself. Skipping an available match to prioritize something else is rarely the correct order, because nothing else on this list offers a comparable guaranteed return. Stage 3. Any high-interest debt, addressed in parallel with the ongoing small investing habit rather than sequentially before it. The reasoning here is specific. Carrying debt at a high interest rate, while also not investing at all, wastes the compounding years described in the previous section for no benefit, since the debt would still need to be paid regardless. Running both simultaneously, even in modest amounts each, preserves the early compounding years while still addressing the debt at a meaningful pace. Stage 4. Broad, diversified investing, increased steadily as the debt shrinks and eventually disappears, and as income rises over time. This is the core engine described in the previous section, and it continues indefinitely, receiving an increasing share of the total surplus as the earlier stages are completed. Stage 5. entered only once the foundation above is solid. A second category of asset, whether that's real estate, an ownership stake in a small business, or an expanded version of the investing already underway. This stage looks different for different people and different income levels, but it should never be attempted before the foundation, because a second asset acquired on an unstable base tends to collapse the entire structure the moment the first real emergency arrives. Follow this order, not because it's the only order that could theoretically work, but because it is the order most resistant to being derailed by the kind of ordinary bad luck, a car repair, a medical bill, an unexpected expense, that reliably arrives in everyone's life sooner or later, and that has ended more wealth-building attempts than poor investment choices ever have. One further practical note on stage 1, the emergency reserve, because the correct size of this reserve is frequently misunderstood in a way that either delays investing far longer than necessary or leaves genuine vulnerability in place. The reserve does not need to reach a large, intimidating figure before stage 2 and stage 3 can begin running alongside it. A genuinely modest starting reserve, enough to absorb a single ordinary unexpected expense without resorting to debt, is sufficient to begin the parallel work of stages 2 and 3, with the reserve itself continuing to grow gradually in the background, rather than needing to be fully completed in isolation before anything else starts. Treating the reserve as an all-or-nothing prerequisite to be fully built before a single dollar goes anywhere else is itself a version of the same delay pattern responsible for the income ceiling myth described earlier, waiting for one condition to be perfectly satisfied before allowing progress to begin on anything else. The reserve, the debt reduction, and the early investing can and should run concurrently, each receiving a portion of the available surplus, rather than proceeding in a strict, sequential waterfall that pushes the genuinely important early compounding years further into the future than necessary. Specialized knowledge on a budget. Hill placed enormous weight on the principle of specialized knowledge, organized and directed toward a specific end, as one of the primary engines of accumulated wealth, and this principle carries particular weight for anyone starting with a modest income, because it is one of the only wealth-building levers that requires almost no capital to begin, only time and deliberate direction. Here is the distinction that matters. General knowledge, however extensive, carries very little earning power on its own. What produces income is specific, applied knowledge that solves a specific problem someone else is willing to pay to have solved. This is available to build regardless of current income level, because it is built primarily with hours, not dollars, and hours are available to nearly everyone in some quantity, even on a demanding schedule. The practical approach on a limited budget looks like this. Identify a skill adjacent to work you're already doing, or adjacent to something you already understand reasonably well. Rather than starting an entirely unfamiliar field from zero, this shortens the distance to the point where the knowledge becomes valuable enough to sell. Use free and low-cost resources deliberately, rather than assuming expensive credentials are required to begin earning from a skill. Extensive, genuinely useful instruction exists at little or no cost across nearly every practical field, and the earning potential of applied knowledge is rarely gated by the price of the material used to learn it. Dedicate a fixed, modest amount of time each week specifically to building this specialized knowledge, treated with the same non-negotiable consistency as the automated investment described earlier. An hour or two weekly, sustained over a year, produces a meaningfully different skill level than the same hours compressed into a single burst of enthusiasm that fades within a month, which is the far more common pattern, and the reason most attempts at building a marketable skill never produce income at all. Once the skill has reached a level where it could plausibly solve a real problem for someone else, even a modest one, the earning phase should begin immediately, rather than being delayed further in pursuit of additional preparation. Specialized knowledge that never gets applied to an actual paying situation remains, functionally, general knowledge, interesting, but not yet converted into the asset it was always capable of becoming. The value isn't unlocked by knowing more. It's unlocked by the first transaction, however small, that proves the knowledge is worth paying for, followed by a second and a third, until it becomes a reliable secondary stream layered on top of whatever primary income already exists. This secondary stream, once established, does two things simultaneously that matter enormously for the mathematics described earlier in this script. It raises total income, and, if directed correctly rather than absorbed into new spending, it raises the surplus available for stage 4 of the asset acquisition order, accelerating the entire compounding process running underneath it. There's an important sequencing decision within this section worth addressing directly, because people frequently get stuck deciding between two reasonable-sounding paths and end up pursuing neither. Should the specialized skill be built as a side pursuit outside a current job, or should the effort instead go toward developing deeper specialized knowledge within the existing job itself, aimed at advancement rather than an entirely separate income stream? Both are legitimate, and the correct choice depends heavily on individual circumstance. But here is the distinguishing question that tends to clarify it. If your current employer has a clear, demonstrable path where deeper specialized knowledge translates into meaningfully higher compensation within a reasonable time frame, and that path is genuinely accessible to you rather than blocked by factors outside your control, developing knowledge that serves that specific internal path is often the faster route, since it leverages an existing relationship and existing trust, rather than requiring you to build both a skill and a market for it from nothing. If no such path exists, or exists only in a distant, uncertain form, building an external, independent skill becomes the stronger option, because it does not depend on any single employer's willingness to recognize or reward the specialized knowledge being developed. Many people benefit from doing a version of both simultaneously in modest proportion, treating the internal path as the primary near-term lever while building the external skill more slowly as a longer-term hedge against the possibility that the internal path stalls, changes, or disappears entirely, which happens more often than most people plan for. Neither path should be abandoned entirely in favor of the other without a specific, considered reason, because each protects against a different kind of risk to your income that the other does not. The geographic and housing lever. For most people, housing represents the single largest recurring expense, often by a wide margin over every other category combined, and yet it is frequently the expense least examined, least negotiated, and least questioned, treated almost as a fixed law of nature rather than as a decision with genuine alternatives attached to it. I want to name this directly because of its outsized effect on the savings rate described earlier. A modest reduction in housing cost, sustained over years, frequently produces more total surplus than an aggressive reduction across every smaller discretionary category combined, simply because of the size of the underlying number being adjusted. A 10% change to a large expense outweighs a 50% change to a small one, in raw dollar terms, and housing is very often the largest expense a person carries. This doesn't mean uprooting your entire life is the correct move for everyone, and I'm not suggesting that as a universal instruction. It means the housing decision deserves the same deliberate examination given to smaller expenses, rather than being treated as fixed options worth genuinely evaluating depending on individual circumstances. Sharing housing costs with another person where that's a realistic option, negotiating rent directly with a landlord, particularly at renewal time when the cost of losing a reliable tenant often exceeds what a landlord initially assumes, or relocating to a genuinely lower-cost area if your income source allows it, which has become a realistic option for a meaningfully larger number of people than it once was, given how many forms of work no longer require physical proximity to a specific location. The same lever applies, in smaller form, to transportation, which for many people represents the second largest recurring cost. The specific size, age, and financing terms of a vehicle carry consequences that compound over years in exactly the way the investing described earlier compounds, except in this case working against the surplus rather than for it, since a vehicle payment functions as a direct, ongoing subtraction from the exact number the savings rate depends on. Neither of these adjustments needs to happen all at once, and neither should be pursued to a degree that produces genuine hardship or instability, which tends to backfire by making the entire plan feel punishing enough to abandon. But a single deliberate look at your largest one or two recurring costs, examined with the same seriousness given to a net worth statement, frequently reveals more available surplus than an extended period of cutting small, visible, easily noticed expenses ever will. There's a psychological pattern worth naming here because it explains why most people, even genuinely motivated ones, tend to focus their cost-cutting effort on small, frequent expenses rather than the large, infrequent ones that actually carry the greater weight. Small expenses are visible constantly: a daily purchase, a weekly habit, and their frequency makes them feel more controllable, more within reach of daily willpower, even though the actual dollar impact is often modest. Large, infrequent expenses like housing or a vehicle are decided once or renegotiated only rarely, and precisely because the decision doesn't repeat daily, it doesn't receive the repeated attention a daily habit does, despite carrying a dramatically larger effect on the overall savings rate. The corrective is to deliberately schedule a periodic review of these large, infrequent costs, at a lease renewal, at an insurance renewal, at any natural decision point, where the cost could realistically be renegotiated or reconsidered, rather than assuming, by default, that no attention is needed simply because no daily decision is being made. A single hour spent examining and renegotiating a large annual or monthly cost, once or twice a year, frequently produces more surplus than months of vigilant daily tracking of considerably smaller expenses, and deserves proportionally more of your deliberate attention than it typically receives. Protecting the base. Everything built through the stages described so far can be undone quickly by a single uninsured catastrophe, and this section exists to make sure that doesn't happen, because protecting accumulated wealth is not a separate topic from building it. It is a required component of the same process, frequently skipped by people focused entirely on growth and entirely unprepared for the specific kind of loss that erases years of progress in a single event. Basic insurance coverage, health, and depending on circumstances, coverage for a vehicle, a residence, or income itself in the event of a disability, is not a discretionary expense competing against the investing described earlier. It is what prevents a single bad event from forcing the liquidation of everything invested, in exactly the scenario the emergency reserve from stage 1 was built to guard against on a smaller scale. The reserve handles ordinary bad luck. Insurance handles the catastrophic version that a reserve alone could never absorb. This is worth stating plainly because insurance frequently gets treated, on a modest income, as the first thing to cut when money is tight, precisely backwards from how it should be prioritized. A missed month of investing delays the compounding curve slightly. An uninsured catastrophic event can erase the entire accumulated base outright, sending the net worth statement back to zero or below, regardless of how many years of disciplined saving preceded it. Review your actual coverage, honestly, against your actual risk, rather than assuming existing coverage, or the absence of it, is adequate simply because it hasn't been tested yet. This review costs nothing but time and belongs on the same list of foundational actions as the net worth statement and the emergency reserve, because all three exist for the identical purpose, making sure the base, once built, actually stays built. The ownership ladder. I want to name explicitly what the entire structure of this script has been building toward, because it's easy to follow individual instructions without seeing the larger shape they form together. The shift being described across this entire video is a shift from being purely an earner to becoming, in increasing degree, an owner, and this shift happens in stages, not in a single leap, which is precisely why it's realistic on a modest income rather than requiring a large one from the outset. The first rung of this ladder is simply having any surplus at all, however small, the gap between income and outflow that the entire early portion of this script was built to establish and protect. Without this rung, none of the following rungs are reachable, regardless of how much is eventually earned. The second rung is directing that surplus into genuine assets, as strictly defined earlier, rather than into consumption disguised as progress. This is the rung where the compounding curve begins its long, flat, unrewarding early stretch, described directly in an earlier section. The third rung is adding a second income stream built from specialized knowledge, which both increases the raw surplus available and reduces total dependence on any single employer or paycheck as the sole source of financial stability. The fourth rung is the point at which accumulated assets begin producing meaningful income of their own, dividends, interest, rental income, or growth in a business stake, income that arrives independent of hours worked, which is the specific technical definition of the ownership Hill wrote about across his study of wealthy individuals. This rung typically arrives later than most people expect, consistent with the flat early stretch of the compounding curve, but it arrives reliably for anyone who maintained the earlier rungs consistently rather than abandoning them during the unrewarding years. The fifth rung reached by relatively few but genuinely available to anyone who sustains the previous four, is the point where owned assets produce enough income to cover the survival number entirely, ending the structural dependence on any single paycheck altogether, not necessarily ending work, since many people at this stage continue working by choice, but ending the requirement to work in order to survive. Notice that every single rung on this ladder is reachable from a modest income. None of them require a large starting salary. All of them require the same thing, a genuine surplus, directed consistently into real assets, sustained through the flat years, protected against catastrophic loss, and gradually reinforced by a second stream of income, built from deliberately developed knowledge. It's worth being honest about the actual timeline this ladder typically requires, because vague optimism about eventually reaching the higher rungs does more harm than a realistic estimate would. For someone starting genuinely at zero, on a modest income, with consistent execution of everything described in this script, the first three rungs are typically reachable within a small number of years. The surplus, the asset direction, and the second income stream are all things that can be established and functioning within 12 to 24 months of deliberate effort. The fourth rung, meaningful income generated by the assets themselves, typically takes considerably longer, often a full decade or more of sustained contribution, consistent with the compounding curve described earlier that stays flat for a long initial stretch before beginning its steeper rise. The fifth rung, full independence from a paycheck, varies enormously by starting point, savings rate, and income, but for most people building from a modest income, it represents a realistic multi-decade outcome rather than something achievable in a handful of years, however disciplined the execution. This longer timeline is not a discouraging fact. It is simply an honest one, and honesty about the actual timescale involved is what allows persistence to be sustained across it, rather than being undermined by an unrealistic expectation of speed that the mathematics were never going to support in the first place. Persistence at low altitude. Before addressing the final foundational asset, I want to name directly a specific difficulty unique to building wealth from a modest starting income, because it is rarely discussed honestly, and its absence from most financial advice leaves people unprepared for something that will, without much doubt, happen to them. For a considerable stretch of time, often years, the net worth statement described early in this script will show numbers small enough that they feel almost embarrassing to acknowledge, even privately. This is what I mean by low altitude, the early accumulation happening far below any figure that feels, subjectively, like real progress, even while the underlying mechanics are functioning exactly as intended. This stretch is not a sign the plan has failed. It is the direct, unavoidable consequence of the flat portion of the compounding curve described earlier, compounded further by the fact that a modest income produces modest absolute contributions during these same years. Hill wrote extensively about persistence as a distinct trait, separate from and more difficult to sustain than the initial decision or the initial burst of motivation that typically accompanies any new undertaking. He observed that the majority of people who fail to accumulate wealth do not fail because their initial plan was flawed. They fail because they abandon a sound plan during the specific stretch where it produces the least visible reward, mistaking the absence of visible reward for evidence that the plan itself was mistaken. The specific danger at low altitude is comparison, not to a wealthier person, which is a separate and equally corrosive trap, but to an imagined version of the plan that should, by now, have produced more visible results than it has. This comparison is based on a false premise, since it assumes the curve should be steeper earlier than it mathematically can be, and acting on that false premise by abandoning the plan guarantees that the steep, rewarding years further ahead never arrive at all. The corrective is not motivation, which tends to fade precisely during long, unrewarding stretches regardless of how strong it was at the outset. The corrective is the monthly net worth check described early in this script, examined not for its absolute size, but for its direction, month over month, across an honest span of a full year, rather than any single month in isolation. A trend line moving consistently upward, however modestly, at low altitude, is proof the mechanism is functioning correctly, even when the absolute numbers remain small enough to feel discouraging when compared to anything else. Health as capital. One asset rarely discussed in financial terms and yet foundational to every single mechanism described in this script is your own physical and mental capacity to sustain the effort involved, the actual hours of work, the actual attention required to maintain discipline across years, the actual energy needed to build a second skill on top of an already demanding primary income. Hill observed, across his extensive study of both wealthy and struggling individuals, that sustained achievement of any kind required a level of physical and mental vitality that was rarely accounted for as a deliberate input, treated instead as something that simply existed in the background, available without maintenance. This assumption fails, reliably, over a long enough timeline, and when it fails, it tends to fail at precisely the moment years of financial discipline are closest to producing visible results. This is not a call to overhaul every habit simultaneously, which tends to fail for the same reasons an overly aggressive spending cut tends to fail. It is a reminder that basic maintenance, adequate rest, reasonable movement, attention to genuine warning signs from your own body, rather than pushing through them indefinitely, functions as a direct input into every other mechanism in this script, because none of the stages described, from the emergency reserve to the second income skill, can be sustained by someone who has quietly depleted the physical base required to execute them. Treat this maintenance with the same seriousness given to the automated investment described earlier, not dramatic, not all at once, but consistent, because consistency is what the entire system has depended on from the very first section of this script. The charge. Everything described in the last 39 minutes rests on a single reversal of a belief that keeps a great many people waiting indefinitely for a starting point that never quite arrives, the belief that wealth building begins once income rises to some sufficient level. It does not begin there. It begins with the gap, however small, between what arrives and what leaves, directed deliberately into things that actually function as assets, sustained through years that will, without exception, feel slower and less rewarding than the effort deserves, right up until the exact point the curve finally does what it was always going to do. Hill did not find that the wealthy men he studied started with large incomes. Many started with considerably less than what a great many people watching this currently earn. What he found, consistently, across hundreds of individual cases, was a mechanism, present from an early point, applied without interruption across years, that offered no visible reward for a long stretch of time. I want to close on the specific relationship between effort and reward that this entire script has tried to describe honestly rather than optimistically, because it's the piece most likely to be forgotten the moment the discouraging months actually arrive. The relationship is not linear. A year of disciplined saving and investing at low altitude does not produce a proportionally small, steadily increasing reward each year in sequence, the way effort and reward relate in most other areas of life. It produces almost nothing for a long stretch, and then, provided the stretch was survived without interruption, produces a compounding acceleration that eventually outpaces what the same effort would have produced under a linear relationship by a wide and growing margin. This nonlinear shape is precisely why persistence matters more here than in almost any other domain of achievement, and precisely why so many people, reasoning from the linear intuition that governs most of daily life, conclude too early that the effort isn't working. It is working. It simply doesn't look like it's working yet, for as long as the mathematics of compounding require, which is longer than intuition expects and shorter than it feels while living through it. You now have that mechanism laid out in the specific order it needs to happen. Calculate your net worth tonight, if you haven't already done it while watching. Identify your current savings rate. Set the first automated contribution, however small, before you sleep. The years ahead will feel slow. They are supposed to. Begin anyway. Go and do it.